Hi, I'm Tim Sullivan. I'm the director of UC Press. I'm here with Mark McCoy, the author of a new book, Maps for Time Travelers: How Archaeologists Use Technology to Bring Us Closer to the Past. The book is a guide to how technology is revolutionizing the way archaeologists study and reconstruct humanity's distant past. From using satellite imagery to 3D modeling, archaeologists today are answering questions about human history that could previously only be imagined. As archaeologists create better and more complete picture of the past, they sometimes find that truth is in fact stranger than fiction. Mark is an expert in geospatial archaeology and an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Southern Methodist University. He's the author of over 40 scientific journal articles on the archaeology of the Pacific Islands. So Mark, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what can you tell us about the motivating factors for writing your book and who you see as the key audience?
Well, those things are really intertwined because I came at this project with the idea that archaeology is for everyone. And it's something that underlines the kind of archaeology that I do, although I don't get to sort of express it in the written form. I'm mostly a professor. I'm writing for a very narrow archaeological audience, a lot of technical sorts of papers. And so what I want to do with this book is to kind of bring archaeology to anyone who's been curious about the past, who has sort of interacted with archaeology in a museum, or maybe they found something or they visited a site, and they have a kind of picture in their mind of what they think maybe archaeology is. And some of that is certainly true, but it's changed a lot. And what it means to be an archaeologist has changed a lot, having to do with the kinds of technologies that we work with. And so really the idea of the book was to kind of try to draw in folks who are interested, curious about archaeology, but really maybe haven't really taken a class on archaeology or sort of had it introduced to it in any kind of formal way. And that's who I was hoping to reach with it.
Yeah, I always think about the arc for your reader and kind of your subject matter. It reflects a little bit my own experience of, like, when I was a little kid, I used to go hunting for arrowheads with my Uncle Bill and just go, he was pretty good at it. We'd go walk through the woods in Vermont. And then by the time we got up to the mid to late 90s, as we talked a little bit beforehand, I was working on a journal called Remote Sensing of Environment. And so I think of like you introducing people, and I'm just going to address this head on, the image people have of archaeologists as Indiana Jones, and your book is radically different than that, kind of the way archaeologists work today. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that particular work, kind of how contemporary archaeology works, or the kind of archaeology you do.
Sure, and just drawing on your own experience there, finding artifacts. That's a really common experience. And in fact, I think if you talk to folks, lots of people have found things out and about, and so much so that you would not think that archaeology is actually that rare of a thing, like to find sites and artifacts. And that's true. They are precious when we do find them, but they're everywhere, right? And it makes sense because we've only been living on this planet the whole time, right? So everything that our ancestors have ever made or dropped, or if we're talking about human remains, they're right here, right? They may not be in great shape. You may or may not find them, but they're here. And so we have a whole lot of new technology that's come online in the last 20 years that tells us about where we are, right? And so the most common, of course, is GPS satellite navigation. No one gets lost anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have, a degree in surveying to go out and make a map anymore, because you can use your GPS. You can interact with it online. You can interact with satellite imagery from drones. You can drag things over the ground and scan the ground. You can use lasers to make LiDAR maps of things from a distance or up close, these 3D models. All these technologies tell us about the where, right? The where we find these things. And because they're everywhere, we need those technologies to kind of confront the massive amounts of potential evidence of what was going on here on Earth in the distant past.
And that kind of plays into the whole conceit of the book, which is archaeology not as adventure, but as time travel. Can you say a little bit more about that as the central kind of the central construction of what you're working on?
I'd be happy to. And, I should say, someone my age, has watched Indiana Jones as a kid. Like, I'd be lying if I said Indiana Jones wasn't, my, reason for going into archaeology. But it wasn't my reason for staying in archaeology,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that popular image, again, because they're fun adventure movies. They're a really poor analog for the job I actually do. Like, and I would like to tell people that my job is full of, kind of adventures and punching Nazis and things like that. But the reality of it is, I think about the past a lot, and I have certain tools that help me kind of tell nonfiction stories about the past. And we have a whole, um, kind of vocabulary and for talking about nonfiction versions of the past, right? And here I'm talking about the genre of time travel, which coincidentally is about as old as archaeology itself. People started being curious about
Mm-hmm.
the past in a nonfiction way, and also exploring the idea of people in the modern day going to the past at about the same time, right? And so, as an analog, a fiction analog for the kind of thing that archaeology actually is, Indiana Jones is a very poor fit. Time travel kind of forces you to think about, well, what would it be like to be back there? And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of puts the person in the present in the picture of trying to imagine what the past is. Because there's no doing this that doesn't involve us in the modern day reconstructing the past. We can't discover something.
Mm-hmm.
We are always the conduit of telling our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think time travel does that in a nice way, and in often a really complicated way. And readers and creators are really clever in how they do that. We have a whole sort of vocabulary for doing that. I thought, this is a really much easier way to kind of explain what it's really like to do archaeology than the kind of adventure piece of the kind of Indiana Jones version of archaeology.
Right, and it gets at that kind of also gets at that, because we're telling our own story through this, kind of getting into the self-reflexiveness that has to come with that exploration of the past.
Yeah, that's right. And really, if you look at and again, these Indiana Jones are themselves great stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're problematic as a version of archaeology because they're about the goodies, right? The things
Mm-hmm.
that we find, and we try to take very good care of the things that we find. But what we find is hardly the point. What we want to find things out, right? We want to get information out of the things that we find and curate. And otherwise, if we don't make that distinction, then there's really not a lot of difference between archaeology and grave robbing or something awful like that.
So maybe it would help to make this kind of concrete. So could you give us an example of a time when the kind of geospatial technologies that you're talking about really helped archaeologists reveal a picture of the world in a way that you found surprising or that fascinated you?
Yeah, I'd say it's something that's kind of creeped up on me, right? In the sense that because the technology tends to make what I do really efficient, right? So I don't wonder about like where I am when I'm out in the middle of nowhere, because nowhere is nowhere anymore, right? As long as you can get a GPS signal, you can know exactly where. So it makes a lot of what I do a lot more efficient. But the kind of the big picture thing, stories that we get to tell with this kinds of data, what it does is it doesn't limit me to talking about just the archaeology that I can see and then I can record it at one site. It lets me work cumulatively with essentially every archaeologist who has ever been on that landscape. I can marry their data up with what I've got, and then we've got this kind of collective look at what we've found there and what we think it might tell us about the past. And if you scale that up, what that means is that we can start to look at the past in terms of a scale at which people lived their lives, right? Because under, except for probably very exceptional circumstances, people don't live glued to one spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
We move around, right? And we move around in our days, we move around over our lifetimes. And ideally speaking, if you want to understand people in the past, you got to look at that kind of a scale. You can't just keep your head in a hole and look at this one place, right? So in a very concrete way, when I go anywhere into a new place I haven't been before, I don't go there, with with my machete and imagine I'm going to reveal, something that's never been seen. I get to work cumulatively with everything that we've learned about that place, and add to that. And it means the next archaeologist that comes along, they can add to that, right? And again, because it is such a big project of trying to figure out what happened in the past, and lots of our finds are accidental, like the finds that those artifacts that you found when you were out walking around with your Uncle Bill, right? We gotta have techniques that are going to take advantage of those moments to kind of scale them up so that we can tell, nonfiction stories about the past that are rooted in material evidence.
So two of the things I think I hear you saying are about scale, right? Being able to kind of take this a big slice of actual physical space to go deeper into the past in some ways, in a way that being on site would not allow one to be, or perhaps would take a very long time. And then layers, right? Being able to dig down in layers into the past, both through time and through a site, or through a piece of geography. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. And, the archaeology at the end of the day is kind of a blunt tool to reconstructing the past. We're not like historians, unless you're talking about a time period where we have written records.
Mm-hmm.
Most of archaeology, most of the time periods we're talking about, there are no written records, there are no historic photographs,
Mm-hmm.
there aren't things like that are capturing the past in that way. So we have to be very careful and clever in how we look at all of the bits and pieces that we've got to try to make a reconstruction that is, again, grounded in good physical evidence that we can point to and say, this is what happened. We're pretty sure, or to say, we're not sure about this aspect of the past, but this is why, and this is what we want to find
out. Mm-hmm. Which you're setting up future archaeologists for the work that they could potentially be doing. And the way that this was really concrete for me in the process of kind of making the book was the jacket, the image on the jacket. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So that's, I should say, like a lot of the things in my book, it's not about the jacket, the dust cover did not come from my research. This is research by a team in Africa. And what they had done is they had gone to the site of Laetoli, where in the 1970s, these incredible footprints have been found preserved in ash, preserved in volcanic ash. So this is like, imagine it's 3 million years ago and a volcano has just dumped a bunch of ash. It rains, the ash gets a bit wet, and then it's like cement, like wet cement. So these were essentially the first evidence, or some of the strongest evidence for walking upright. There's other fossil evidence, but this is really something that you can, it's a moment in time, right? A footprint is a really an evocative thing to discover. We don't find them very often. Well, they found some new ones. And instead of, like in the 1970s, we have a few kind of black and white photos and some news coverage, and you'll see them in textbooks and things like that.
Sure.
They immediately went and said, okay, well, let's make a 3D model out of this. And that's what they did. And they made these incredibly beautiful maps, really, they're maps, but they're maps of a single footprint, right? They're extraordinarily detailed. And this is important for that era of the past, because we have so few relevant specimens, and there are a lot of speculation about what went on that far in the past, that you have to be able to have data sets that other scholars can interact with. So they put their 3D model online in addition to making those beautiful maps. And so it is a really it kind of marks, to me, a real turning point, where here's a discovery that is, at the same kind of importance as this discovery in the 1970s. And what's different is the technology, right? The technology to kind of communicate that, to kind of really get an idea of what it is that is there in that place. I also like that it's about mobility and movement, because so much of scaling up is getting people on the move, right? Finding things like, you don't necessarily think of the road as an archaeological site, but the Romans built if you stretched out the old Roman roads across the old Roman Empire, they would go, all the way to the moon. They're an incredibly huge archaeological site if you want to think about them in that way.
Right.
That's what a lot of this technology is doing, is really helping us kind of get into that kind of mobility and travel and so forth in the past.
Yeah, that I found that explaining that cover image, because when we're talking to either our sales representatives who have to go off and sell the book, or to booksellers, or talking to people who might cover the book, that concreteness, like when you say it's about the geospatial revolution in archaeology, people are like, all right. But when you say, oh, here's this you remember from your archaeology textbooks, those black and white pictures of footprints. Well, here is what technology allows now. And it's like a light bulb going off, which is just really remarkable.
That's great. I think that's great that people interacted with that. I mean, it is, you couldn't pick something further from my specialty, right, in archaeology, but it's the technology is the overlap. And that's the revolution part, is archaeologists, we don't, who don't know each other, who don't, collaborate, and work on very different problems of reconstructing the past. We have, in our different ways, found these group of technology extremely useful, right? So not just in our field work, right, and knowing where we are, but in the kind of analytical and in the kind of these 3D reconstruction side of things.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Thanks for writing the book.
Oh, thank you for publishing.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. So Maps for Time Travelers is now on sale in both print and digital formats. Please consider purchasing the book online through bookshop.org or IndieBound to support independent booksellers. You can find those links on the UC Press page for the book. Mark, thanks again. That was really fascinating. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.